from the villages and from the cities, bookkeepers, soda jerks, mechanics, college students, rich man, poor man, beggar man, thief, doctor, lawyer, merchant, chief, now veteran fighting men.
My father was a dentist. The dental office that he had was in the front of the house. Our house was fairly good size, and it was right on the main street. And the front room was his office, and in fact, our living room was his waiting room. The grade school was about maybe 4 or 5 blocks from us, and of course we walked to grade school. And the high school was a little further, and we either walked or took our bikes and. I graduated in 1939, and in September of 1939 I enrolled in the University of Illinois at Champaign, Illinois, and I lived in a I guess you'd call it a rooming house, and that was my first encounter with military service, because Illinois was designated as a land-grant college. In other words, meaning that the federal government had allocated many, many acres of land to these universities, and Illinois was one of those. So one of the stipulations for that was all male students who were willing, or not willing, but were able, were enrolled in the military called ROTC, which is Reserve Officers Training School, and we had a class just like any of the other classes we'd have. Then we had one class a week in military, in which we had to, well, not had to, but learned all the organization of the Army. You had to learn, how many people were in a squad, and then how many in a platoon. The main function or action of the class was we had close order drill with a rifle, and you had to learn how to stand at attention, stand at ease, present arms, and one of the things that you had to learn was there's one command called to the rear march, and you'd take one more step and then you'd turn smartly around and go the other direction. And of course it took a while to get used to that, because somebody would always forget to turn around and then they'd all run together. So in your squad. Each man was assigned to a military unit, and I was in what was called the Coast Artillery. And this was, we had 155 millimeter howitzers, and then we had some 3-inch anti-aircraft guns. And of course we just had blank ammunition, but we'd have to load the gun, and well, somebody had to learn to be the I don't know what they called him, the gun officer, and he would tell you that you had to do things exactly correct. In other words, you had to sort of by the numbers, and you'd load the shell and close the breech, and then they would say fire, and you'd pretend like you pulled the lanyard, and then there was a small airplane on the top of the armory, and as that little airplane went across on the wire up there, well, you had to track it with the there was a big box with a lot of optical equipment in it, and you had to track that because you had to lead the plane, estimate a speed. When I was in ROTC in Champaign, and as I say, I was in what was called the Coast Artillery, but there was also a unit in the military called Pershing Rifles. It was voluntary. In other words, And if you joined the Pershing Rifles, they gave you a special thing to wear on your shoulder, kind of a braided loop and down under your arm, and also one of the reasons I joined is because you could wear your uniform at a formal dance. They used to have dances, and of course some of them they required a tuxedo, and in order so you didn't need to you didn't have to rent or buy a tuxedo. Why, you were permitted to use your military uniform. That was considered proper, and so you'd wear your uniform to the dance, and that way you didn't have to buy a tuxedo. In the fall of '41, that's when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. That was, of course, extremely, what do you want to call it, disruptive. In other words, by that time I had been transferred to Chicago, and I was in dental school in Chicago, and our class had to go to the gymnasium, and we all just sat on the floor, most of us, and the announcement came over the radio that we were at war with Japan, and in the end we listened to Roosevelt's speech on the radio, and then at the end of that, why the instructor, whoever was in charge of that group, they had no answers for you, because nobody knew what was going to happen, and you just went back on home to your, where you lived, and so that was the first encounter with wartime.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan. With the unbounding determination of our people, we will gain the inevitable triumph, so help us God.
The way to victory is plain. So wake up, America. We must win or die.
And everything was, I don't suppose I should use a turmoil, but no one knew what was going to happen to them. You wondered what's going to happen to your status. The local draft board in your hometown really was they had the priority over your, what's a good word, fate. And if they wanted 10 people, well, they would just go through that list and take 10 of them. We were exempt from being drafted, and the reason for that was all professional, pre-professional persons were in that category. Like if you were a dentist, a physician, a pharmacist, but if you were in that other category, well, you did not get called at that point in time. They wanted you to finish school before you were taken into service, because they wanted to use you as a professional person. In other words, a trained professional person rather than a draftee. See, in '42, the normal curriculum would be that you would be off for the summer until September of '42, and that they didn't do that anymore. In other words, you stayed in school without any vacation, because they wanted you to get through as soon as possible. in order to stay in school, you had to agree that when you graduated, you would immediately become enlisted in service. There were several changes being made as we were in other words, first we were in the service, then we were a private. There we had the uniform issued at Camp Grant, and I remember went through a warehouse, and as you went down along, they did the paperwork. They signed you up for $10,000 worth of insurance. They didn't ask you if you wanted it or not. It was just automatic. And when you came to the clothing part, there was a supply sergeant, and he would look at you, and he'd say 32, 24, and size 7.5. And then they would issue those clothes, and surprisingly enough, they usually fit. In other words, he could tell what size you wore just by looking at you. And from that time on, that's what you were supposed to wear. You weren't supposed to wear civilian clothes. But they sent you back to where you lived, and then when you went to school, well, you put your military. Well, you were dressed as a private. Then at one point in time, they promoted us all to privates first class, which amounted to $4 a month more than the $50 we were getting otherwise. They did have you line up in the mornings for a roll call, and I'll tell a couple of you might say some funny things. And of course, you had an overcoat, an olive drab, nice heavy overcoat that covered you all up, and you didn't have to put your full uniform on. You could put your overcoat on and go out and say here when they called your name, and then go back and either go back to bed or else put your uniform on and go to class. So sometime before graduation, the plan was to make us first lieutenants. So they gave you an allowance. I think it was $150. And you had to go buy your own uniform, and they told you that there were specifications. It was very definitely what you had to buy, and there were stores downtown in Chicago that were familiar with this because you'd go down to the store and they knew exactly what you needed, and so you got, and that was then you were dressed as an officer. When you graduated, they did not use caps and gowns. You graduated with your military uniform on. And of course, when you graduated, there were, the classes were good size. And they always use the terminology. They say, we will cut your orders. And they would cut your orders, and what you received a mimeographed sheet of paper, and your name was listed on it with your serial number. And let's see, my officer's number was 017-56122. And then on that sheet of paper, it would say, just report to Fort Meade, Maryland at 0600 or whenever the time was on a certain day, they usually gave you about 10 days before you had to go there. And then you had, as an officer, you wasn't like an enlisted man. They'd put them on a troop train and they'd all go together. But with an officer, you were on your own. They didn't care how you got there; just get there. And then the next thing all you were doing, you were waiting. You were waiting to be assigned to another facility. And the next one we were sent to was Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania. And that was supposed to be basic training, just like the enlisted man went to basic training, only their basic training was much more intense. When they had to they had to do the usual things like they possibly would need to do in combat. One of the highlights was the fact you had to crawl on your stomach, and they had barbed wire across about, I don't know, it was about shoulder high, and you had to get down on your stomach and crawl under that. In the meantime, they had machine guns on one side of the area that you were working at, and they would fire those machine guns as you were crawling underneath that wire, which would make you keep your butt down. And that's the only time I ever had to do that. In other words, the enlisted men, they had to do that numerous times, and they had other activities which were much more strenuous than the officers. The officers were just supposed to have a small amount of it so that they would have a understanding of what the enlisted men were going through. After I went out of Carlisle Barracks in Pennsylvania, then again you received your orders, which was a mimeograph sheet, and there'd probably on the one that I got, there was probably at least a dozen, maybe more men that were assigned to Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, to the dental clinic, because down there is where you actually did the dentistry for the troops. And again, as an officer, they just said be there. They didn't care how you got there. But in the meantime, I bought a car. It's the first car I ever owned, and so myself and another one of the fellows that was going to Claiborne, we drove my car from it'd be Carlisle Barracks, but we stopped at our home first, and then we went to Louisiana. According to you had your papers in your pocket or in a briefcase, and it would tell you to report on a certain day, and that's what you did. You went to the headquarters, and they assigned you to a barracks, and they were very nice. They were each officer had his own room. You had your room, and you had a bed, and it was a cot, and there was also there were either one or more enlisted men. They would take care of your room. They cleaned it. They made your bed, and and then you were assigned to the dental clinic, and you reported there on whatever it was designated a certain day, and you would go in, and there would be a large room, and there would be probably at least a dozen, or maybe as many as 20 dental units set up in a row. And a dental unit meaning is where you have a chair and you have a unit and you have all the instruments you need, and then they would send over a certain number of recruits in the morning. In other words, say at 8 o'clock, they would be the waiting room would be filled up with GIs is what we always call them, of course, and then you would have your unit, and then they would send. They would say, "Mr. Jones, you go down to chair number 12," and then they had to come down, and you had they would have in their hand a form. And what you did with that first form was you examined the person, you examined the man's mouth, and you would chart all of the dental restorations, like if he had a certain kind of a filling or a crown, or he had a missing tooth, why that you put that in the chart. And what that went with his 201 file, which that was your own personal file, 201 file. And on that chart, they could identify a body. If that person happened to be killed in service, why they could take the DIR, and then they could say, "Oh yeah, that's the right guy because he's got a tooth missing at a certain place, and it's marked on this chart." That was one of your duties. And then, of course, the other duty was to take care of whatever dental problems that particular person had, and such as a filling or an extraction or whatever. And then when you were finished, why, you'd sign his completion record, and then he'd leave, and then you'd get another one. And of course, you just did this every day. You report whatever the hours were, like usually 8 o'clock in the morning, and so that's what we did at Camp Claiborne. Each dentist that was working in one of the Army clinics, they needed to have an assistant. So the way they were doing it there at Camp Claiborne is they had a training course for dental assistants, and any of the girls that had graduated from high school and were qualified, they could go to that training facility, and they would teach them how to be a dental assistant. Then after they were trained, then they were hired by the Army. Well, one day they brought over, I suppose, 4 or 5 of the girls that had just recently completed their dental assistance training, and as they